What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another breakdown video for the Detroit Lions. And today, we are diving back into the free agency side of things with a player that feels like he's gone under the radar a little bit too long. So let's get it started. Today, we are back with another breakdown video. And I'm super excited for this video because we've talked about this player a little bit. We've shown some graphics. I may have said some things on a few shorts posted on this channel, but specifically, this needed a full breakdown because this is a player that feels like he's been a little bit overlooked in what he could potentially mean for the Lions this upcoming season. And I think some of this may have been brought to light a little bit when PFF ranked our defensive line at number 4 heading into the season. And then they also ranked this player as one of the top 32 edge rushers this season. And I'm not talking about Aiden Hutchinson. Maybe that brought some light to this situation. And it feels like the perfect time to dive into this player. Now, it's understandable why he would be overlooked, specifically because historically, he's just dealt with a ton of injuries. From shoulder to toe, ankle, he's dealt with a chest, he's dealt with a ton of injuries, and he's missed a significant amount of time. That being said, though, most seasons outside of last season, he typically plays double-digit games. But last season was such a disaster with the Minnesota Vikings after signing a prove-it deal, having a high ankle sprain that essentially limited him to playing in 2 games. I mean, he barely played in the first game, and then the last game he only played 17 snaps against the Chicago Bears. So he really only played like 2 games, Kansas City and Carolina, this past season. Statistically, didn't do a ton production-wise. It was also graded as his worst season according to PFF. Only 7 pressures on that season. But because of that, the Lions were able to sign him to a 1-year, $6.5 million deal with $3 million fully guaranteed. Some of that's within a void year going into next season after his contract expires. I feel like we may be overlooking this player a little bit too much. And I know I brought the stats up before, and I'm going to do that again to get this thing started before we start diving into the player and the film that I watched. And I will say this, a lot of the film that you're going to see in this video is from 2022. There is some from 2023. I've went through all of his 2023 games multiple times, so I've already done that. But a lot of the film's actually going to be through 2022 because it's just a much larger sample size. It's also a little bit of a different role we got to see Marcus Davenport in, and that is who we are going to be discussing today. I don't think I said his name yet. Marcus Davenport, the Lions' 1-year edge rusher signing this offseason that I think is getting a little bit overlooked. So that's the perfect place to start. Let's just start with a little background in terms of statistics here. Let me give some perspective to all of this because, as I mentioned, outside of last season, he usually plays double-digit games. For example, last year he played 118 snaps, 4 games, only really played in like 2 of those games. But before that, 2022 played in 15 games, 490 snaps. 2021 played in 11 games, 437 snaps. The year before that, in 2020, 11 games, 374 snaps. The year before that, 2019, he played in 13 games, 533 snaps. So again, you don't expect that you're going to get a full season. You're probably going to have some missed time here. But let's just say if we just went based on that, he played in 11 games, 11, 12 games for the Lions. I would be happy with that, honestly, as a Lions fan, on a 1-year deal, especially if he gives you similar production to what he did throughout that sample size with the New Orleans Saints as a former first-round pick out of UTSA, because this is where things get interesting. And without even watching the players, these numbers, I think, are going to draw your attention. So Marcus Davenport, as I said, last season, 7 total pressures according to PFF, 9% pressure rate when you take his pressures versus the pass rush snaps that he had. However, when you start to go through those years where he had a much larger sample size to look at, 2022, 34 pressures, 12% pressure rate. 2021, 42 pressures, 14% pressure rate. 2020, 34 pressures, 13.65% pressure rate. 2019, 51 pressures, 14.3% pressure rate. Now, those sound great, but we need context. So let me give you some quick little context. Let me give you a couple comparisons. First off, how about Danielle Hunter? Now, I'm not saying this is Danielle Hunter, but let's just do it because Danielle Hunter is one that we know well as Lions fans. He was available this offseason. A lot of Lions fans wanted him. Danielle Hunter this past season had 80 total pressures. Obviously, he's doing this in a much larger sample size, but he was getting those 80 pressures at a 13% pressure rate. The year before, he had 70 pressures and a 12.3% pressure rate. So while it's a much larger sample size, as you can see, that's a similar pressure rate to what we were getting out of Marcus Davenport essentially year after year after year with New Orleans. Another player, Jonathan Greenard. I've used this example before. Signed a big deal this offseason with the Minnesota Vikings coming off his breakout season across from Will Anderson with the Houston Texans. He had 48 pressures, had a ton of sacks, which is really like the number that stood out to everybody is the sacks. I'm more of a pressure guy personally. All right, I want you affecting the quarterback. And again, a pressure is anything between a sack, hurries, quarterback hits. The one I don't love the most is probably quarterback hits. Obviously, it's after the ball is out. But all of those things equal a pressure. And he had 48 total pressures, Jonathan Greener did, and an 11.85% pressure rate. That is lower than every single season in the last 4 seasons with the New Orleans Saints for Marcus Davenport. Let's throw another name, Leonard Floyd. Again, you look at the sack number, much higher. However, Leonard Floyd, this past season, 41 pressures at a 10.5% pressure rate. Year before, 54 at an 11.2% pressure rate. Year before that, he had 58 at an 11.2% pressure rate. Year before that, he had 45 at a 9.1% pressure rate. What I am saying is the sample size may not be as large as certain players, though, again, Jonathan Greener, that's kind of a similar number to what we've seen from Marcus Davenport, again, outside of this past season. But what we do see is when he's on the field, production follows. He gets after the quarterback at a pretty high rate, as we see. This is not at the Aiden Hutchinson type of rate, but for number 2 edge rushers, like I said in the little short that I think was posted, I don't know if I said in the short or just in the live stream, but there's a world in which Marcus Davenport could be the best number 2 edge rusher in the NFL this season. And if we simply said that, hey, guarantees healthy for 12 games, you could buy into that being a real possibility, especially if we're just talking about a guy that affects the quarterback, because the pressure numbers back him up for multiple seasons. So we'll have to see what he looks like returning from Minnesota and potentially in a little bit of a different role than what Minnesota did with him. I don't think they used him the best. That being said, though, the numbers speak for themselves. Marcus Davenport. So who is Marcus Davenport? What are we talking about here? Well, we'll talk about a 6'5.5" defensive end that's 27, nearly 28 years old at this point, 264. Again, a former first-round pick that has really good arm length, essentially 33.5-inch arms. And when you looked at his testing scores coming out of UTSA, of course, a much smaller school that was picked at number 14, New Orleans traded up to go get him at the time. The guy ran a 4.58 40, which is an incredible 40 time, with a 1.63 10-yard split. It's a little bit pulled back from the 40 time, not the exact same as what you would expect from that kind of 40 time number, but it's still a great 40 time. 33.5-inch vertical, which is good. A 7.2 3-cone time, which is another good score. 22 bench press reps, which is more so average. Again, some of that can kind of play into length and build. A 4.41 20-yard shuttle, which is above average, and a 10.04 broad jump, which is a great score. So he tested out extremely well across the board. Now, I will also point this out. When you see the Saints clips, he's wearing 92. When you see the Vikings clips, he's wearing the number 0. Just keep that in mind. So with all that being said, let's dive into Marcus Davenport. Let's start here first. Let's start with the get off. Let's start with the first step. And this is an area where I gave Marcus Davenport a good grade. But this is an interesting area for me with Marcus Davenport because I personally like him, and I wasn't sure this was going to be the case. This is actually not what I thought coming into it because at UTSA, he kind of played in a stand-up role. I thought I would like him more in that stand-up role, and I know he has a lot of flexibility. He does to the defense where the Lions can put him in a lot of different alignments. You look at how Minnesota used him, not just sub-packages where they would walk him around, play him over the center like we see with a guy like Micah Parsons, for example, but they would also use him as a 9 technique on early downs. They put him extremely wide, a wide alignment. They'd move him around the front. With New Orleans, we saw him mix from a 3 technique, 4 technique. He'd go head up with tackles. When tight ends would shift over, he'd go head up with tight ends, play that 6 technique. And then with Minnesota, usually play more on the outside of those alignments rather than playing head up with guys. But we've seen him basically play all the way from a 3 technique to a 9 technique. That being said, it was more so between the 4 and the 9 technique, which is where he lives. He's not going to be more of a defensive tackle for you. But what's interesting about this category is I expected to like him more, especially in terms of get off from that 2-point stance. But that's actually not the case. I like him a lot more with his hand in the dirt, which is, I guess, a little bit kind of the opposite from Hutchinson. Remember when he came out of Michigan, it was like, man, I kind of like him standing up a little bit more. The Lions have allowed him to do that. But with Marcus Davenport, I actually like him a lot more with his hand in the dirt. Now, I think he's effective in both spots. And typically he's going to line up from what we've seen historically as your right defensive end, which means that he's going to get mashed up with your left tackle, which on paper is perfect because Aiden Hutchinson typically lines up against opponents' right tackle. So it actually meshes perfectly together in how both guys typically align. But especially from that spot, I like him much more with his hand in the dirt. I feel like there's a lot more explosiveness in terms of there's not that little false step and kind of hitch in terms of getting off the line for Marcus Davenport, which I think slows him down from a 2-point stance, especially when he's aligned up against your left tackle. It feels like there's a little bit of delay getting off the line. Footwork and a created false step, but I feel like that is negated when you watch him when he's putting himself in a 3-point stance or a 4-point stance when he has his hand in the dirt. I don't think you see as much of that false step, and he gets off the line with a lot more consistent explosion.
Now, one thing that I do like when he gets off the line is he's constantly low upfield in his first step. However, when you talk about moving laterally, that at times, especially throughout the rep, you can see him start to scrape a little bit high on the play. And you can also see the footwork change, where in that first clip, his footwork is he's trying to create that depth with his inside foot versus when he's playing on the backside of the edge, he's able to kind of just skip through. Again, it's not consistent with that knee bend. It's not easy. He's also just kind of a naturally taller player. So this can be a little bit of a problem, especially as the rep unfolds. But getting upfield with good lower pad level, that's something especially when he already has his hand in the dirt that finds to be effective.
Also, you're going to see that he doesn't have the most slither. He's also not the most agile pass rusher. And even when you see him getting off the line, kind of some of the tightness in his hips, that does pop up. Just look at how he lines up when he's lined up against opponents' left tackles. He kind of plays staring at the ball, but he's not lined the same way that he would on the opposite side of the field if he was in a stand-up role. If you put him in a stand-up role, I actually like him lined up against the right tackle a lot more. In certain games, we saw that. I think Tampa Bay, San Francisco, where he would switch over to that side. I like him more in that spot than a stand-up role, but I love his consistency with his hand in the dirt. And this is effective really wherever he is along the defensive line. Great, though, about his first step is the consistency that he plays with getting off the line of scrimmage. The consistency and reactive timing that constantly shows up, the ability to watch the ball and get good jumps on the football. You'll see occasions where he's kind of timing up the snap count, but you rarely ever are going to see him jump off sides. I didn't know one example where he jumped off sides. Also covers good at depth, and I think it especially shows up a little bit closer to the football that he is. Again, sometimes I don't love that when he's in that stand-up role. It feels like he's getting a little bit limited out of his snaps. It kind of has like a build-up into his second stride versus first stride. It just doesn't feel as effective. I think there's good explosiveness there. He covers good ground, but it's not elite in terms of the strides. Now, as a pass rush plan and some of the lacks of flexibility, I think also that does slow down sometimes the strides and the depth that he's able to create, which kind of limits his plan. He kind of has to pull himself back or seemingly slow himself down to be able to set up like inside counters, things like that, because he can't naturally kind of fly through the pass rush, which pulls back his place a little bit and I think does hurt him. He anticipates the snap. He also, you'll see it against run plays, for example, he's very quick into position, kind of like what you think of with an interior offensive lineman, like how quick are you set on the play. As a run defender, he's very quick to get himself set, sit himself down, create a wide base, get his feet underneath him, and be very strong at the point of attack, especially if it's not just setting the edge against an offensive tackle, but instead dealing with the tight end head up or an offensive tackle head up on the play, backside of a zone play. He's very quick into that initial point of attack, into that initial stance and creating a really strong base. But even the same thing at setting the edge against offensive tackles, he's very quick to get his footwork into that spot, and he's really quick to react to an offensive line scheme. Hey, they're going outside zone to the right. He's very quick to get his footwork going that direction. Now, as the play rolls on, I don't think some of that lateral athleticism is fantastic, and then he kind of starts to pull himself behind, and I think, again, some of that's because he's a little bit stiff, and then he kind of turns the runs. But in terms of like the first step into that lateral movement, it's very good in terms of the timing. It's also very good in terms of just the reactive quickness in those spots. See some of his best examples against the run where he's just constantly blowing up some of those pin pull looks, and we got to see this against Atlanta. We got to see multiple examples where teams would try to pin it down with a receiver, maybe a tight end, and then they try to pull around the outside, and he would just blow up these plays with his consistency. The biggest issue also here is that he could fall a little bit behind within that first step because he's aggressive upfield, and if it does move laterally and he is off on his kind of like judgment there, then he can fall himself behind, and then some of that recovery is not going to be great. That being said, though, another little aspect that I like is while I think he's a little bit stiff, I do like that there is sort of that short area quickness within his game, able to very quickly kind of come to balance and shorten his footwork, kind of like you would think with like a cornerback, to stop his forward momentum and slow himself down. At times it doesn't look great. We've seen him fall in occasions like this where he's trying to stop himself quickly and then he just takes a tumble to the ground. He's a little bit upright, but for the most part, I do like how he can kind of shorten his footwork and position himself into a spot where he's not completely overrunning the play. Very consistent, very good timing. You don't get offsides penalties. It's not elite. It's not special. It doesn't look like I'm watching James Houston or even Matthew Betts at times, but it's good. And that's the grade that I ended up giving Marcus Davenport there. I just like him a lot more with his hand in the dirt, especially when you talk about sub packages, hand the dirt, stick him inside, let him work one-on-one with the guard. You feel a lot more suddenness when you watch him in those spots. You feel a lot more of that explosiveness and getting guys off guard.
And this might be a little bit of a better example here with his feet and hands in unison, as we'll talk about, but it's really that explosiveness. I mean, the 1-2 off the line of scrimmage, got on the guard's left hip in this spot, opens him up, and then he's able to transition that back inside. That's just explosive. It's that consistency off the line. And then this other play, I'm just showing it because this is something that we did see, especially with the Saints. The guy drew attention. He was the guy that drew the attention of offensive lines. can always use that.
Than you do if you have him stand up like over a center, for example, and there's other issues that come into that. Moving on to just the pass rush side as a whole, I didn't give him like an elite grade here, but I gave him an above average grade in this position for me. There's things that I like, there's things that I don't like. I think there's limitations here. The biggest thing that I do like about this is that I feel like the more snaps that he gets, the more effective he seems to be. And I brought this up in one of our past streams. With Marcus Davenport, it doesn't always look pretty, yet somehow he always walks away with pressures. He still finds a way to affect a quarterback. Even if it looks very ugly, he'll still find a way to affect a quarterback. And what I mean by that is if you look at him for 2022 and you look at his entire 2022 log, every game that he had at least 20 pass rush snaps, 20 pass rush opportunities, he at least checked in with one pressure. But for most of those games, multiple pressures. Game by game, one pressure in one game, two pressures in another, four in another, four in another, six in another, one pressure, three pressures. That's what he did in every game that he had at least 20 pass rush snaps. I think for him, what you really do see, and it's not like you're going to get strings where he's just beating guys over and over and over. You don't typically see that. And there's certain matchups like we'll talk about, like Trent Williams. I thought it was like the worst game that I watched, where every time he matched up with Trent, didn't seem like he had really a good plan to go at him, and it was just like, shut that guy out of the game. But obviously at right tackle, when he slid over against McKivitz, he had some success. Trent Williams, arguably the best tackle in football. But that being said, is when you watch him, the more snaps that he gets, I feel like he does a really nice job with discipline and kind of his vertical push, but also the fact that he does a nice job in terms of reacting to the move that he just utilized against an offensive lineman. That could be on the interior, that could be on the outside. You know, early in the game, he uses an inside move where he's slanting inside or crashing inside on a stunt against a guard, and he tries to hit him with, I don't know, a sidestep. He can come back and kind of play off of that. But especially against tackles, if he's able to kind of work back-to-back snaps together and he's able to find that little rhythm, that's where I feel like he does a nice job of kind of setting up, like, I showed you this, now I'm going to do this because I just showed you that.
Now, here will be a good example because you're going to notice that it shows a plan for Marcus Davenport, more unison with his hands and his footwork. But you also notice on a rep like this, as good as this is, one, his chest seems to be a little bit exposed on this inside move, and then also the hands feel like they can be a little bit late here, where if the offensive tackle gets a hand on the chest cleanly, he can kind of halt this rep. But you do see with more reps, he's able to come up with a nice plan.
And that's where he starts to open up real success, because I don't think he has the deepest bag of just terms of ways to win, especially around the edge or even with his inside counters. He has flashed the ability to win inside, outside, and through his man, which is usually where he likes to win. So what I'm saying is I think the more snaps you give him, a little bit of rhythm he's able to find, and he's able to kind of show you one thing and he can start to kind of play off of that, that's where I think he starts to find a lot of success. Now, he can be a little bit of an upright pass rusher, which of course you don't love, and at times it felt like he was really lacking some knee bend, especially with Minnesota, maybe like sitting himself down or sinking down into contact and creating the kind of force that we got to see in the past when transitioning speed into power. Though it looked a lot better with the New Orleans Saints, I will say. It just looked rough, especially in his final game against Chicago. It was better against Kansas City. It looked rough against Chicago. Biggest issue, and we'll talk about this more with flexibility, but to kind of just get it started here, is I think that he's pretty stiff in the hips, especially when you watch him trying to like turn the corner, for example. I think he does bring some knee bend, and if he goes back to especially what we saw in 2022 and he looks like that guy, I think he shows real knee bend in that transition from speed to power, ability to create real force, create momentum in his bull rush attempts, and create force through the ground, which is very consistent. He can do it over and over and over. That is something I think he does carry, and that's where you can see that transition from upfield push. He's a little bit of a threat there. He plays with good discipline and transition that into just walk back and not back, and he is a physical menace, man. I mean, it is a lot of force that he brings. However, I think the stiffness in his hips can just limit his ability to consistently turn the corner and roll through the corner. He also seems to lose speed in those spots. And then if you talk about just in terms of just turning the edge and winning through the top of the rush or the high side as a pass rusher, that's where you'll really see issues, especially with contact. His footing starts to get out from underneath him, or he doesn't have the best balance in those spots. And then you'll also just see like he really loses speed trying to turn the corner at the top of the pass rush. So he's obviously much more consistent playing through offensive tackles and playing with more of that forceful style, which again, as we always say, it's what the Lions say they're looking for. That's what they want, especially opposite Hutchinson. They want a pocket collapser. This is the prototype pocket collapser as a defensive end. He's just that. Like, if you were like pocket collapsing defensive end, he's not going to win every way, but he'll collapse the pocket more often not because that's how he likes to play. this is that piece for you, especially when we get to some of the effort and things like that. It's versatility, and you'll see versatility in his footwork, specifically in his strides, the lateral stride depth that he is able to create, especially on some of the stunt usage. You also see the spin footwork, and this is where I really like the control that he plays with, where into his dynamic kind of spin setup, he's not out of control, he stays balanced, he fights through contact really well. He carries great contact balance, which is huge. That's working through pass rush moves. That's where you constantly see second, third effort wins, late wins, where you're like, why is he still getting after the quarterback? It's like, dude, if you hold him the ball, at some point he's going to break through. He plays with big-time effort, but he plays with really good contact balance. He keeps his feet underneath him. He keeps his feet on the ground usually. He's not caught in the air very often, even though you'll see some flashes of trying to kind of have that little skip step or skip through pass rush attack. He doesn't carry much slither to go along with the flexibility. This is where I didn't like him for Minnesota, where they were standing him up over the center and they were having him like work between a center and guard. I just didn't like it because he doesn't have that natural slither to kind of split blocks, and you'll see a lot of examples where he fails to split blockers, or if he's trying to win inside, he may use his hands, but he doesn't actually create much separation from the offensive line. They kind of just stick with him as they're opening up. So even if he gets a win and gets himself clean, they kind of just stick with him in his hip. I don't like him in that spot. I like him working on offensive tackles. I like him a little bit more there. Or I like him when you try to get him one-on-one with a guard from an outside shoulder alignment, right? If he's trying to split a tackle and a guard, because a tackle you could pull out with another edge rusher, or an offensive guard, if you can get him one-on-one in the interior, then that's a spot where I like the suddenness because he's explosive and consistent off the ball. And when it turns to the sub package, he's very good at getting off the line of scrimmage and just reading the ball and being very consistent there. And then with those strides, he's able to be very sudden and explosive and very violent with his hands, and he can get kind of those quick wins. And then he shares that contact balance where even through the punches, if an offensive lineman connects, he still finds a way to kind of just gradually knock you back and walk you back to the quarterback. And he's got that force of just a pure pocket collapser. Like you always talk about one of those guys that are going to collapse the pocket from the interior. We've looked from that from Pascal. He's shown us flashes. I think he brings maybe the most consistent pocket collapser that we have seen to this point. Maybe someone else develops into that, but so far I think he brings that to the table. He also utilizes a nice little inside, outside, inside crossover move. And again, this is another one with the footwork where you can set this up. He can create strides.
You want to see him be more proactive with his hands, but in a play like this, watch how fast he just comes to balance, like we talked about earlier, and then he's able to get that quick win.
He has a nice setup into this, and it comes back to that discipline when he pushes vertical, and also just setting up offensive tackle sets a little bit differently based on what he showed before. He really plays off his own work really well. Now, some of the knocks here to go along with that is predictable plans as a pass rusher, and this comes really back to the hand usage, where I think he gets very predictable and like, this is how I'm going to try to win, and then his hand usage doesn't seemingly give you a lot of variety off of that. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but you don't get a lot of like surprises, it seems like, as an offensive tackle. I mean, he'll definitely mix up his approach, but it doesn't feel like he's throwing people off guard consistently, and you'll get some predictability there. Starts to lose some of that burst trying to turn the corner on the edge. Now you get to a spot where he's not consistently winning that. He's allowing Triple Ames to sit down and create an anchor, and then again, because of some of the lack of ability to consistently slither inside on some of his inside pass rush moves, and the guys are able to kind of stick with his hip there, even if he gets that initial win, he's not going to consistently finish, and that's where you get more pressures than sacks in those spots. So we have seen that, and we've seen at times where you've had to flip him to opposite sides of the field to try to get some more wins. So again, above average for me as a pass rusher, but I think in terms of just like technically speaking, he's not the most sound pass rusher, but the pressure rates speak for themselves. The effort is there, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the biggest thing is that he's going to knock you back. He's going to walk you back. He creates excellent force.
And where he probably does his best tying his hand usage and his footwork together is actually bull rush attempts. You usually don't think of that, but this ties his agility a lot better. He squares up blocks. He shows the dip. And then you're also going to see like these last steps into creating that force in contact.
Don't look at the bench press reps and be like, man, he's not going to create no force. This guy walks guys back constantly. He's violently. He's just very explosive from the ground. And if he looks anything like he did with the New Orleans Saints, he's just going to consistently knock people back. And then the contact balance, because of that, it opens up variety in terms of stunts, but it also just opens up late wins consistently. Now, his play strength specifically as a run defender, but just in general, this is an area where I love him. This is my highest grade to this point. I just think he plays with excellent. He plays with great play strength. Okay, now there's inconsistencies here, but I think he plays with great play strength just across the board, and this is one of those things that you can kind of bet on with this player. Jolting players back at the point of contact. He can drop his weight at the point of contact. As I already touched on, his quickness in positioning, getting a wide base, a strong frame into contact to set the edge is very helpful for this as well. I think he plays with putt plus pad level, specifically when taking on pullers. Like, not only does he have the mentality to just take a puller head on. Like, here comes the guard. I'm stepping down. I'm dealing with that. Not only does he have that, but he also plays with good technique in those spots as well. And just quickness, short area quickness, good balance, wide base. Some of it was a little bit shaky, I thought, in 2023, where it didn't always feel like that. For the most part, you constantly feel that, and that plays into the play strength as well. He squares up his bull rush, and you'll see it. He doesn't carry maybe the best flexibility, but he does carry some of the back bend. He carries enough knee bend. He carries that force and momentum that he's able to create, and then he plays with really locked in tight hands on contact, where he just feels like he's just bench pressing guys. He is just a handful for tight ends in terms of length, the fast hands at the point of attack, and just kind of the strength that he brings. But even against tackles, that ability to get very tight inside and create walk back and create coming at force on contact. Now, when you talk about shed, there are examples where he doesn't shed as quickly, or with tight ends, they'll hang with him too long, and we'll talk about that. But in just terms of like getting that initial knot back, that is something that's pretty consistent, and he's very violent. When he gets his feet in the ground and he's in a spot where he's not kind of rolling over, this is where I think you get less consistency with like a long arm. Even though he has good length, you don't really see long arm be consistent, because unless the traction's on point, honestly, I think playing indoors is going to help him. I really do. Like watching some of the games where the weather got bad, it just felt like he was playing really slow. Honestly, I think playing indoors is going to help him speed him up. Hopefully that's the case. We know New Orleans played in the Dome. I just feel like it helps him being in a good environment. So I could be wrong, but I think that's going to help him, especially with his agility there, because he's just so explosive. I think it's going to help him. That being said, though, I think because that you get some of the inconsistency with like long arm creation, where he's trying to, kind of create flexibility and lean into that, even though you'll see some flashes, but more so it's that ability when he can really transition, drop his knees a little bit, and create that like last second stride into contact. That's where you get immediate force, and that's what you see versus guards and things like that. And that's where he gets sudden, because he is very threatening, where he can knock you back, but then he also has that explosion where press guards utilize a quick sidestep, and then again continue to work through contact and then just be a pocket collapser. Because for the interior, you're not always looking for sacks, you're just looking for guys that are going to spill the quarterback, and he can definitely do that. So play strength, to me, I think he's great there. It's my highest grade at this point. Over to hand use, this was a tough one for me, because I think it's better than what may be thought of with Marcus Davenport, but I don't think it's great. I gave him an average grade in this spot right now, but I still feel a little bit difficult on this one, because at the beginning, again, I had a lower grade here. I thought he was playing with wide hands at the initial punch, especially against jump sets. Like, that's something that he just didn't seem to have a great plan for. Again, I think indoors will help him. Outdoors just didn't feel like he had the agility to then do anything with it. He didn't always have a great plan for dealing with jump sets or short setting offensive linemen that got in his chest early on the play, and I don't think that was something that necessarily got better when I watched him, and I thought his initial hands were a little bit messy. That being said, though, what really stuck out to me as I continued to watch was I just feel like there was inconsistency with his footwork and his hand usage being on the same schedule. Like, okay, my feet want to go here, but my hands are a little bit behind, or I'm not finding the break point on this move as a pass rusher, or I'm utilizing my hands, but I'm not necessarily getting the contact, and then my feet are just slow to kind of get behind. Even if my hands connect, my feet don't allow me to actually clear an offensive lineman. I just felt like things were a little bit inconsistent in being in unison. I don't think that the ceiling is extremely high for that to actually be super polished up. What you do like here from hand usage, I think he plays with very fast hands, outside of specifically as a run defender, when one, and this is more so from Shed, but I'll just throw it out there now, he leaves his frame open too much, where he leaves his chest exposed. Guys kind of latch, especially on the interior. This is why he's not an off-ball linebacker. Let me say that right now. To me, he's not a linebacker. He's a defensive end, okay? I want him getting contact a lot quicker. I don't want him dealing with offensive linemen. I don't love his shed ability once he starts to ask move laterally. I know I'm kind of peeking into the next category, but I don't view him as much as a stand-up, walk-around kind of linebacker. Maybe the Lions will. I don't think that he's that. I don't think that's where he's at his best. That being said, though, he's very fast with his hands. He's very reactive with his hands. He's violent with his hands. And he's also very good at kind of continuing to trick his hands and string moves together, where he has variety. You'll see the side swipes. You'll see some swim move effectiveness. You'll see the inside punch with consistent tight hands in those spots. You'll see variety there. But it's really that ability to continue to work. And some of that's contact balance, but he continue to work his hands through the pass rush rep, continue to fight off, continue to battle to keep himself clean. I think, honestly, that's the best aspect of his hand usage. What I talked about with all this strength, to me, where he stands out the most here is specifically, obviously he has kind of that bench pressing strength, but it's really the core strength. That's where he stands out to me. I think he has very, very strong, very good core strength, and that's where he is a problem for offensive linemen. It's that ability to kind of jolt you around through the core. I think that is where he's extremely strong as a pass rusher. That's where he feels like he overwhelms guys, and that can help him a lot in terms of just kind of creating force in some of his hand usage as well. His hand swipes are consistently effective, and then when setting the edge, he does a nice job of getting an inside arm, getting his inside arm out there quickly, and utilizing his length. Now, I think as the rep unfolds at setting the edge, at times he could be pushed too far up the field. Going back to Shed, times kind of issues getting back over the block. But if he's initially just trying to set the edge and hold the edge and force you back inside, that's something that he's very capable of. To me, it comes back more to his base in that spot and continuing to reset through the rep. That's where you'll get inconsistencies, or it'll be a little bit slow in terms of some of the stiffness there and like rolling my hips to flip myself back around to the ball. But just initial point of attack, usually you have good hand usage in those spots. Again, it's the issue of repositioning where he'll get himself where he almost feels like he's reaching, and then that's where you can get like chop downs from an offensive tackle and it'll kind of throw off his balance. And he feels like he's reaching more so than really digging in and holding his ground, where he's kind of popping up and he's like throwing his arm out there, and then all of his weight starts to shift to his inside arm, and that's where you'll get issues, just not really resetting his base to a consistent spot, I think, throughout the rep. You want to find more ways to consistently just beat a jump set, even if he can recognize it, just consistently trying to tie his hand usage and footwork together to have more success in those spots rather than just getting lashed on. That moves you on to the shed aspect, is getting off blocks, and as much as I kind of gave him some knocks there, I actually gave him a better grade in this spot than hand usage. I gave him a plus grade in this spot because a lot of that strength that he carries, he's able to really bully tight ends as a point of attack. I think he's going to see a lot of that work. His twitched up footwork that's very proactive into contact, ability to take on pullers, it's kind of everything that he does before contact, which I think allows him to be a very capable player in terms of creating shed, especially as a run defender. The issue here is where you ask him to get very rangy. I think that's where problems come into play, where you're asking him to work laterally. You know, you're asking him to stand up and work laterally and deal with blocks. That's where I think you get issues. You saw it with Minnesota. You ask him to get rangy in terms of, hey, set the edge, flip back over your block, now get back inside. Like if I'm asking him to bench press and kind of press into another gap, I think he's very capable of that. If I'm asking him to hold his ground and then roll back over the block, now I think some of the lack of agility throws back his ability to shed a little bit. So I think it's also what you're asking of him in this spot. I don't want to ask him to have a ton of range in this spot, even though he's a good athlete and he has that closing burst. Don't think that's where you consistently want him. He does have finishing range, which is different, but in terms of just shedding, I don't think you want to ask him to cover a whole bunch of range there.
And back to some of the hand usage here and also positioning through the rep. Instead of being content with this chucking blocks early in the play and being forceful, instead maybe latching a little bit more and controlling the block through the rep to allow quicker shed opportunity.
You'll also see sometimes when he gets to the backfield, he splits the gap. He doesn't always anchor himself down to just hold his ground. Instead, you know, he'll get to a spot where he'll kind of get propped up a little bit, and naturally he's just on the taller side, so it can be a battle for him to kind of deal with pad level consistently. He plays with so much force through his body that even on the interior, when you see him ability to maintain a gap or hold gap and a half or handle guards at the point of attack, and you see that force, that initial jolt, that initial like, hey, I'm playing at the line of scrimmage. I'm not playing beyond the line of scrimmage. I'm playing at or behind the line of scrimmage, and then being able to kind of work through that. If you ask him to handle a single gap, now his length becomes more effective. You ask him to start to work really wide, now his length becomes less effective. That moves you to the area where I have his lowest grade, which is agility at this point. I'm below average here right now. Honestly, I consider going even lower with this grade, but I think there's things that he does well here. Let's talk about the ability to kind of shorten up his footwork in certain spots. He also has some fluid footwork through pass rush moves, that just kind of putting them together. You'll see some good things within his footwork and also his foot quickness, and he'll flash some nice body control here as well, especially when you're on like the backside of contain, you know, kind of speeding up his footwork. It's not always great in terms of getting himself upfield, just planning and sticking. It's also not great in terms of immediately changing speed, like, hey, I want to work like inside, outside. Like it really takes some time for him to gather, it feels like. He does carry some burst. Now, this is a plus that I didn't point out earlier, which is he has this little hesitation move as a pass rusher where he can press you on the play, like based on what he's already done in the past. He can try to open up a tackle, and then he has this ability to kind of stop and hold himself and then create a little bit of like a hesitation and then go again. That's impactful, and he can typically find a way to get an edge in those spots. It's just about finishing, which can be the problem. Dipping and ripping, like that's not always great. He does utilize the rip a lot, but he's not always able to dip the edge. Where he falls into issues here is he doesn't have that great agility, kind of just stop and start, you know, put tackles kind of on an island and just make them work and be able to like shake them. He doesn't play with good shake. He doesn't play with great shake. He doesn't play with a ton of lean either as a pass rusher. His transitions from moving laterally to getting upfield, again, the footwork can be there, but it can be a little bit heavy if you ask him to consistently kind of change directions laterally. I think that could be a problem. And then continuing to work down the line of scrimmage is just less fluid. As I touched about, I think getting initially that first step is very consistent. It covers good depth. He's very reactive, but as it continues to roll along, staying square in those spots is going to turn a little bit, it feels like, more into a chase rather than just staying square and just moving laterally down the line of scrimmage. So it becomes a little bit less fluid in those spots, but he does play with good recovery. You'll see an athlete, he gets off the ground very quickly. He pops off the ground. That's the kind of athleticism that he carries, but also the the effort that he brings to the table. It's that ability to carry some body control, reset his footwork in spots high. But for the most part, there's a lot of things that I do like about body control. It's just like changing the record directions with the quickness and decisiveness that would really put tackles on skates. Like if he had that, he would have pretty much everything you'd want from an edge rusher. Especially see it like in traffic where he's around a whole bunch of offensive linemen and he falls on the ground. He can't really keep his footwork or stay balanced through traffic. You'll see it behind a line of scrimmage when he's dealing with a lot of traffic through a step, or you'll see with offensive line when he gets an edge, especially on the interior when they kind of ride his hip. Even though he's able to deal with that contact balance to continue to just create a mess in the backfield, what he doesn't have is consistently the ability to finish and maintain his footwork, and then you'll see him get tripped up, he'll fall on the ground. So you just don't see good agility within his game. It's the lowest grade that I have right now. I just think it limits him. The other area which I don't love him either is flexibility. Now, I think there's things that he does fine here at an adequate level, but for the most part, I don't love his flexibility. One thing that I do think can be a plus is his upper body flexibility. I think that does show up a little bit at times with some of that ability in the upper body create flexion. It's just not really that much in the lower body, and that's where, again, even with the strides, you just don't see him able to consistently close off or finish when he's able to get an edge or he wins. He does have the hips to open and create some torque in his pass rush, and that's where you get kind of that plant stick and press the quarterback. You'll see him, he'll kind of slide all around. His feet seemingly get slippery. They kind of fall out from underneath him when he's trying to, turn the top of the pass rush arc, kind of stiff when he seems to be working down the line of scrimmage where he's trying to kind of roll over the line of scrimmage. That's not great. I think it also limits him just getting over blocks in general. He doesn't carry the best hips to dip and rip the corner either. He does have some knee bend and twist and some flexibility here, flat and kind of open himself up throughout his knees. I think he does bring some flexibility there. In the ankle, some of that ankle flexion and strength there when trying to turn the corner can be a little bit of a problem. It really shows up with the lack of slither when you're talking about splitting guys in the interior. I don't know why I put this in here, but I did. He played on the field goal block team, too, in 2022. I mean, I don't know if that has anything to do with anything. It really doesn't. But, I thought I'd point out, hey, maybe we get a guy that can block some field goals, extra points. That doesn't hurt. To kind of wrap this thing up, couple things that I still really like about his game. First off, closing ability. Really like his closing ability. This is one of those players where you won't have issues with, like, is he giving effort? Is he going to do that? Especially if you look at anything from the Saints. He looked like his hair was on fire all the time. But even with the Vikings, he plays with really good effort. You're not going to have, I don't think, concerns about that whatsoever. It's about him being on the field. Not is he going to try when he's on the field. He will. And if they get anything they got out of him from New Orleans, which is because he's now with the staff and he feels more comfortable here in the role they want to ask of him, which, again, I think is going to be different than what they did with Minnesota, he's going to be a problem because he plays with excellent effort. It makes sense why the Lions would want a player like this because not only does he have that closing burst, he has good length, he has excellent closing range, kind of when he's out in field. He's a very forceful finisher. I want to give this some credit too, is that this is not a guy that's going to give up leakage, all right? He finishes through tackles. He plays with a lot of power. He wants to hit guys. He is physical. He hits you. And he's not going to give much after the contact. Like, it's not going to be with things where a running back, he hits him one-on-one, and he gets dragged back a couple yards. If he gets a clean shot, he is putting him down right there. That being said, though, it's not always a clean shot. The more he's in space, the less consistency you get because it feels like his lateral agility kind of falls off a little bit, and then you don't get some of that, great technique and form. The further out in space, the wider you get him. In coverage, even though he's capable of dropping the coverage and doing some spot drops, obviously you don't want him to live there. He won't live there for us. He can do it, though. He can get into spots and kind of just be impactful dropping into a position. But the more in space, you're going to get less consistency there just as a finisher. The path that he usually plays with the quarterback, he does a nice job of not overrunning the quarterback and overrunning the tackle. Now, again, some of that's like limited being able to turn the corner, so he has to stop himself and kind of fight back in. But you're rarely going to see him just run beyond the quarterback outside of maybe like a yard or two just because he tried to turn the corner and he couldn't. For the most part, though, he doesn't just run by quarterbacks. He does a nice job kind of planting himself and fighting back into the play. I think he plays with usually some good paths to the quarterback, especially from the interior when he kind of has to just navigate traffic. And you'll see him. He plays with great pursuit. You saw it with the Vikings where he's chasing around Mahomes. You'll see things like that. Ball gets way away from him and he's constantly running into the play. And obviously he has excellent open field speed and just a straight line with that 4.58 40 time. I actually thought he was a plus player in terms of the football intelligence. I didn't know what to expect here. I didn't know how I was going to feel about this because you think about where technically he's not always like it's not always like the most elite. You may expect this to be lower, but I actually think he's a pretty smart player. While at times you don't see him identify screen blocks, at times you will see him identify screen blocks, especially when he's in a comfortable position. He's a nice pre-snap communicator as well, which is noticeable on the defensive line. There was some issues with Minnesota at just not knowing where to get lined up, but I thought with New Orleans, he was fine there. So again, if it's anything similar to that role, which it probably will be, which is there's not just putting you in one spot. You're going to line up against left tackle most of the time, but there's still flexibility here. You're going to line it a 4 technique. You're going to go out to a 9. You're going to play around. You're going to move move around to different spots. You're going to deal with tackles head on, you're going to deal with tight ends head on, and you're going to play with more in that range. You saw some pre-snap communication there. He just looked more consistent. He will lose contain being a little bit aggressive as a pass rusher, or not necessarily being proactive enough to get off his blocks and get in a position to actually help on the play. Then he gets a little bit too far away, and that's where the range can become a little bit of an issue. But he's smart on the backside. He's smart with his backside contain. He knows where his teammates are. He plays off his teammates well. Like, hey, he's got the quarterback. I can be aggressive and dive down here. You'll get a little bit of over-aggressiveness at times, but again, like bootlegs, if he has the backside quarterback, he handles that. His first step usually is accurate. So again, it's like down the line of scrimmage. So then he's able to create good balance, and he's able to work towards the quarterback in spots like that. He carries flat routes. You'll see that as well. You'll see multiple examples where a flat route comes out, pass rush isn't there immediately. He'll drop out and take away the initial look so the linebacker can get over top. Like, that's something that you see. I think he's a plus player in terms of football intelligence. Obviously, it's all about being healthy for Marcus Davenport. That's where it starts. That's where it's going to finish. But if he is healthy and he does anything like we've seen him do over the time when just being on the field, this is a guy I think he's going to be in for an extension for the Lions, and this is the ideal number 2 for Hutchinson. I think if you could build a guy, that would be like the ideal number 2 build for like what would be the great opposite pass rusher for Hutchinson. This is that. I think Pascal brings elements of that, but he obviously brings flexibility where these guys could be on the field at the same time. You could stand up Davenport. You could put Pascal a little bit more on the interior. You could do things like that. I think he brings a little bit more interior presence right now from what we've seen as a pass rusher, so I think he'd be better in that category than Pascal. I think that's a real possibility, but you could have him on the field together because there's flexibility for him to play out wide, and you can kick Pascal in. But I think he could also work on the 4 down front as like, hey, he's your opposite D end of Hutchinson. He brings a ton of flexibility. He's played a lot of different roles, but I think on paper he's the ideal opposite to Aiden Hutchinson as a pass rusher, but also as a run defender. That's a smart player that plays with a fiery effort.
So here are my final grades that I came up with. A couple things to note. First off, pass rush, I slightly moved it up here. I feel like I was a tad too low on pass rush with the consistency. Even though it's not always pretty, the consistency does speak volumes. Also, I moved his shed ability slightly down. I had shed a little bit higher initially, but I moved it slightly down because I do feel like the lack of range at times can be a tiny bit of an issue, also where you put him. And then finally, body control and close I just put together. Body control kind of pulls it down. Close was a little bit higher, but I think some of that lack of flexion and agility really pulls back at times as ability to finish and create sacks, so I pulled that back a tad. And then agility and flexion, 2 of my lower grades for this player, put them together. I thought about even going lower than that, but I'm going to stick at the 4 right there. Finally, the other thing I want to note is just because he's a little bit more of a build-up speed guy, and you see that in the open field, doesn't mean necessarily that he has to be a 9 technique that's super wide in the widest alignment, like maybe with Minnesota or wherever, even with New Orleans all the time, or in a stand-up role, and I think we got to see that. He's capable of doing that, but sometimes having the inability to turn the corner as well as he would like to means that I like him a little bit closer to the offensive tackle, a little bit closer to the ball, because then you get the tackle opportunity to sit himself down and really kind of stall out his bull rush, which is typically his go-to, and that's what he leans on as a pass rusher. One note to the flexion where I pointed out his knee bend, that is an area where I think it helps him most in terms of just changing his path to the quarterback as a pass rusher, and that's where you get that variety. So when you talk about having that build-up speed, I think it shows off the most successful when he crashes in from a defensive end position to work on guard. So when he's crashing in where he can utilize a 1-2, that second stride to really launch himself. It takes really one stride for him to build up a lot of that momentum and force and some of that build-up speed. I don't think he needs a super long runway consistently. You see just enough from going from lining up over a tackle to getting on a guard in sub packages.
Just not the most agile piece, but you want a pocket collapser, you got it. So the competition's going to be real. I like what we have behind it. So if this doesn't necessarily connect for the Lions, I like what they have in Pascal a lot. Obviously, they had guys like Betts this offseason, which are going to be really intriguing. They have Houston coming back. They have guys here, but he has the monster upside. He's shown it even when it doesn't look pretty. And now you're working with the best defensive line coach, according to Dan Campbell. If anything becomes even more consistent here, technically speaking, the guy could absolutely take off. I think he's going to be more comfortable here. I'm buying into it. I think Davenport, it's my prediction now, could be wrong, but I'm going to say it. I think Davenport earns an extension after this year with the Lions because I think he's in for a big season with the Lions. Hopefully it's not like something ridiculous because we got to pay Hutchinson too, but that would be an ideal 1-2 to kind of put together, and I think the Lions would love to see that, and they know what he's capable of. They didn't want him, they wouldn't have signed him, but they did. So with that being said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.